Hello there. I am Erica Barnett. I am the editor and publisher of Publicola.com, a Seattle-based news and politics website that I co-founded in 2009 with a colleague of mine from the previous place I worked, which is an alternative weekly called The Stranger. Before that, I had worked for about 10 years for other newspapers and magazines. And at Publicola, we really focus on local news and politics, but in the last several years, probably last 5 to 10 years, I have really pivoted the site to focus a lot on homelessness, on addiction, and just other subjects that are often about conflicts between the powerful and the powerless. And I think homelessness is a really good example of that. In the mid-2010s, the city of Seattle declared a state of emergency on homelessness formally, and the police started going into some of the larger encampments and sweeping those encampments. And that's when, I really started to turn the site over to covering that issue and the sort of issues around homelessness, including addiction, including police power, and including affordability a lot more closely on Publicola. So again, that's publicola.com. And so that's where I am and where I cover this stuff. And I'm very passionate about it. Another reason, before I start talking about Compassion Seattle specifically, another reason that I'm personally interested in these issues is that I am myself a person in recovery. I have direct experience of addiction that very nearly killed me. And I've written a book about it. It's called Quitter. And it's, available everywhere, but, you can also get it at your library. And I say that just to say that, this is also a very personal issue for me. I think a lot about privilege and the privilege that I was afforded to never become homeless myself. And so that really informs my coverage as well of people who, face a lot of obstacles that may not be apparent to somebody who hasn't experienced some of those obstacles themselves. So that is sort of my personal qualifier for covering homelessness and addiction. So with all that said, Compassion Seattle. So this was a ballot initiative that ultimately was struck from the ballot by a judge. But the plan was to have the voters decide on a change to the city charter that would have done a few things. One, it would have required the city to very, very quickly add thousands of new shelter beds, which sounds great. But the problem or the issue with that is that it would have also not provided any new funding for these shelter beds. So the initiative sort of implied that it was going to be a housing initiative. It was, in fact, shelter. And the underlying agree with that perspective, particularly. I think that we can always look at the budget and find places where we would prefer not to spend so much money. But the implication that we were spending money completely inappropriately and that all it required was a few shuffles of the budget was pretty unrealistic to begin with. And I think that if Compassion Seattle had passed, we would have found that out pretty quickly. And to kind of set the stage for Compassion Seattle, before I go into some of the particulars of who was funding it, why they were behind it, and so forth. Seattle is, if you don't live here, if you're looking in from the outside, it probably appears to be a pretty progressive city with real kind of left-wing credentials. We're on the West Coast. We have a city council that's made up of 8 Democrats and 1 socialist, essentially. And, and we do have progressive values, and it is definitely a lot more left-leaning than where I'm from in Texas, which is a good thing. I mean, I think the title of Compassion Seattle actually expresses the fact that I think there is a lot of compassion here for people experiencing homelessness, although I think that compassion is starting to curdle somewhat as the visible problem gets greater and greater on our streets. At the same time, I would say that, Seattle has a real strain of NIMBYism. And what I mean by that is a kind of flat out refusal to allow housing in most of the city. And what happens when you don't build housing is that, the market sort of trickles down in a way. So the very wealthy people that are moving here for the tech industry are, you taking up the apartments that, maybe I, as a journalist, would ordinarily be able to afford. And it just sort of trickles down the whole way. And so that, ultimately forces people out of the city, and it helps force people into homelessness. So it is extraordinarily difficult to build housing here. We have incredibly high housing costs, third only to New York and San Francisco. And so it's just, there's not a lot of housing here, and that is the root cause, and that is the root problem. There may be many other causes of homelessness, but fundamentally homelessness is a lack of housing. And I've lived here for 22 years now. I've been covering the city for all of that time. And the problem of homelessness has gotten worse, both in the sense that there are more homeless people now. There are tens of thousands of homeless people in Seattle, both sheltered and unsheltered. And there is more visible homelessness. And it's the visible homelessness that I would say, is prompting sort of reactionary proposals like Compassion Seattle. And a lot of our initiatives in the city of Seattle, probably like a lot of initiatives in your cities, are focused on the people that are the most visible. So to go back to Compassion Seattle, it was an amendment, as I said, to the city charter, which is basically the constitution of the city. So in addition to the two things I mentioned, the fact that it proposed building thousands of new shelter beds, but with no additional funding, there was a third element. And that third element was that once these shelter beds became available, it would become fine, it would become acceptable, it would become legal. I mean, it already is legal, but it would enshrine in the city's constitution that it is acceptable to remove people from public places if they refuse to go to these shelter beds. And if you look at the actual number of people who are unsheltered in Seattle, you can quickly see the problem. Even if these 2,000 beds had been created, and they were not, even without Compassion Seattle, there have not been more than a couple hundred new shelter beds created in the city of Seattle. But even if that had happened, we would still have thousands of people living unsheltered on the streets. The difference would be that instead of invisible encampments, they would probably be driven further underground and further into areas in our green belts, underneath freeway underpasses, and places where they are not as likely to be caught out and forced to leave. So Compassion Seattle was backed by a lot of business interests. The main contributors were business groups, real estate investors, and the main proponents were people like the Downtown Seattle Association, which is a group of businesses that represent business interests in downtown Seattle. And so there was also the Greater Metropolitan Chamber of Commerce. So it was business groups that wanted this to happen. There were also a number of sort of moderate to conservative politicians. There's a former city council member named Tim Burgess who sort of drafted the initial version. So there's a real convergence of, business oriented interests who wanted to see this thing happen. And they put more than $1 million into the campaign to make it happen. Compassion Seattle, as it turned out, was very popular. There were a number of polls that took place before the initiative was ultimately not put on the ballot that showed that it probably would have passed with something like 60-70% of support. So what ultimately happened, of course, is that a judge struck it from the ballot, and through a series of court hearings and back and forth, it was ultimately removed. Compassion Seattle as a campaign ceased to exist, but the then candidate, now mayor of the city of Seattle, Bruce Harrell, promised in his campaign to implement Compassion Seattle. And I think it is the implementation of Compassion Seattle that has actually shown how much it was smoke and mirrors to begin with, because Harrell has essentially, in his 2 years in office, declared that he achieved the goals of Compassion Seattle, and specifically that he has identified 2,000 units of shelter and housing for people living unsheltered in the city of Seattle. Now, how did he do that? He essentially took a bunch of shelter that was already coming online, housing that had already been funded through the city's housing levy and other sources, piled them all together in a great big pile and said, this is 2,000 units. What in fact happened during that same period is that the city lost a number of shelter beds and gained a few more, so that we have maybe 300 additional shelter beds at this point in the city of Seattle, compared to when Compassion Seattle was preparing to go on the ballot. And so those 300 beds do not represent even the increase in homelessness that has happened during that period. But in any case, they certainly aren't enough to have offset the thousands and thousands of people who were unsheltered at the time Compassion Seattle was going to be on the ballot. So it was always going to be smoke and mirrors, and I think that has been shown to be the case through what's happened since. And meanwhile, the city of Seattle, saying that it is in compliance with Martin v. Boise, which of course, says that you can't sweep people unless you have somewhere for them to go that is accessible, that they can get to, and that is, an actual shelter bed. City says that it's complying with that, and it has ramped up the amount that it is sweeping people from locations, particularly in big encampments that are visible and that tend to raise the attention of, or get the attention of, the business community. And so sweeps have ramped up to an unprecedented degree. Meanwhile, we do not have enough shelter, we do not have enough housing, and none of those issues are being meaningfully addressed. And to me, that is sort of the most disturbing legacy of all of Compassion Seattle. I think a lot of people supported the measure, thinking that it was in fact compassionate because it was purportedly going to bring 2,000 new shelter beds to the city. And I think now, when you look around and when you are in downtown Seattle and Seattle's neighborhoods, it is quite obvious that the homelessness crisis has not been solved or addressed, even with all the sweeps, even with displacing people constantly and making it incredibly difficult for these large encampments to spring up again. It is very obvious that the situation is getting worse, not better. And so what happens at that point is the compassion, the actual compassion that people felt in saying that they supported Compassion Seattle, in saying that they wanted to help people on the streets by getting them into shelter, by getting them into housing, it starts to curdle. And I think that's a process that's been happening for a long time. And I think this is a national problem, and particularly a West Coast problem, not just a Seattle problem. But people begin to lose that compassion and to feel that the thing that has to happen is just get them out of here, just get them out of my sight. And, we start to see policies. There's cities around Seattle that have so-called camping bans. And Seattle, too, effectively has a camping ban. It's just unenforceable. We have seen a challenge to some of the sweeps that are happening in the city of Seattle on the basis that they are, in fact, in violation of Martin v. Boise, because what the city does is tell people about a shelter bed that may not be appropriate for them, that may require them to split from their partner, abandon their pet, go all the way across town. And it's very hard to get across town here if you don't have a car, someone to drive you. And so people either say they accept the shelter and just don't go, or they, quote unquote, refuse the shelter, which is a rational decision, and stay where they are or just kind of move along. And so all of these supposed solutions that we've implemented, like, these 2,000 supposed shelter beds, do not result in a visible change in homelessness in Seattle. And, it's just gotten to be a much more brutal situation for people living on the streets. And they are often blamed for all manner of things. There's a city south of Seattle where the city council enacted, or is about to enact, a camping ban. And people in that city constantly bring up this idea that there's child sex trafficking rings operating out of encampments. And that is a baseless idea. But the fact that it has caught on, I think, speaks to what people are willing to believe in order to, I think, in their minds, do something about encampments. And so when you have something like Compassion Seattle fail, and when you have it supposedly implemented and things don't get any better or there's no visible progress, it sort of gives sway to these really conspiratorial and damaging beliefs about people experiencing homelessness. And I think that's one of the true tragedies of not just Compassion Seattle, but the whole way we go about trying to solve homelessness in the city of Seattle and the region, which is to say that we can do it without any additional funding or with very little additional funding, by simply using our resources more efficiently. And that's simply not the case. There was a McKinsey report that came out a few years ago that found that we would need approximately $1 billion a year to respond to homelessness in a meaningful and impactful way in the city of Seattle. And currently we're spending about somewhere north of $200 million a year on everything related to homelessness. And that includes just the administration of our homelessness system. So it is not nearly enough. And if we keep doing the same thing, we're going to keep getting the same results. One of the impacts of campaigns like Compassion Seattle is that people really believe that we don't need more funding for homelessness. And the actual result of that on the ground is that regional leaders and local leaders don't believe we need to put more funding into homelessness. And in fact, they look at the system and they say, well, it's not working anyway, so why should we throw more good money after bad? And we see that in the city of Seattle's budget. And I should mention that in Seattle and this region, we've tried an experiment that is pretty, it's not novel in the nation, but it's pretty unique, which is to create a regional homelessness authority that sort of consolidates the, all the city resources, all the county resources, and theoretically the resources of other cities in the area. And the authority has come under a lot of scrutiny, including from Publicola, my publication, for sort of some of its early missteps. It's been around for a couple of years, but it's also come under a lot of scrutiny for supposedly not being effective with the amount of money that it has. And the amount of money that it has is not substantially greater than we were spending before. So I think there is a feeling in this region that the system has to somehow prove itself to work before we'll put more money into it. And the fact is that the system can't work effectively unless we put more money into it. Just in terms of being able to stand up shelter beds, in terms of being able to actually purchase and acquire and build more housing. And so there's a real lack of realism in some of these solutions that I think has become very ingrained in the local political establishment, this idea that we just need to spend smarter, we don't need to spend more. And ultimately, you cannot build housing for free. Housing has become a lot more expensive to build. We're about to pass a housing levy in the city of Seattle. And I say about to pass because it usually passes by huge margins. But the housing levy is going to be triple the size of the last housing levy, and it's going to build about, I believe, 300 more units. So everything's gotten more expensive, and it is very frustrating to political leaders who get yelled at for not doing anything. But at the same time, I think that Compassion Seattle and other efforts to sort of streamline the homelessness system have ingrained this idea that that's what we need, that we just need to have different leaders or better leaders or more efficient leaders. And the fact is, we actually we need all those things. We need better leadership. We need more realistic leadership, and we also need more money. And if we're talking about solutions that don't include any more money, then we're not really talking about solutions. We're just talking about different ways to push people around. Compassion Seattle definitely had active allies in the media, and particularly in one station that put out a piece of propaganda and as well as a follow-up piece. But the one that got sort of national attention was this piece called "Seattle is Dying" that ran on our local Sinclair station, which is called Como. And the premise of this piece and of Como's coverage generally, and as well as a lot of other sort of local right-leaning outlets, is that we really need to take a heavy hand with homeless people, and B, that homelessness is caused by drug use. And I'm sure this is a familiar refrain to a lot of people who pay attention to this stuff. People constantly tell me, and I hear people say in the media all the time, it's a drug problem, stupid. It's all about the drugs. And if they would just get off the drugs and get a job, they would be able to, sustain their own housing and take care of themselves. And I think that is a very insidious message that is incredibly popular. And I meet people all the time who are rational consumers of media and who are compassionate, but they believe that the drugs come first and then the homelessness follows. When in fact, most often it is the opposite. It is people self-medicating. It is people taking drugs to stay up, taking uppers, taking cocaine and meth primarily to stay up all night. It is people becoming hooked on fentanyl because that's what's cheap, and so people have causality reversed in such a way that the policy that you would take out of that is, well, let's just get everybody into drug treatment and that will solve it. Now, of course, we're not doing that either. We don't have nearly enough funding for people who want treatment in the city of Seattle or in this region. And so that is not happening. But meanwhile, the other response is, well, we're not going to do anything for them until they get clean. And I think that has been a message that has been promulgated by a lot of media outlets. It's very unfortunate. And it is also behind the idea of Compassion Seattle as well, and sort of other things like this that say, homeless people need to pick themselves up by their bootstraps, whether it is accepting a shelter that requires sobriety that they do not want or are not ready for, whether it is saying, you have two choices, go to treatment or go to jail. In every single case, there is the onus is put on the unsheltered person rather than the system that created a lack of housing, that made living on the streets the only alternative for someone, and that continues to make it almost impossible for them to escape their drug addiction or alcohol addiction because they have no resources with which to do that. And so I think that has become a really insidious and widely shared belief in the general public in the city of Seattle, and as well as across the country. We are not unique in this regard. But our local media, again, despite the fact that we are seen as a very progressive city with progressive values, the local media does not always reflect that. And I think that it is quite influential and can be quite harmful. There are, of course, lots of local media doing exactly the opposite work, doing great work and, humanizing people. But the dehumanization of people experiencing particularly unsheltered homelessness on television and on radio and podcasts, and I won't get into any names, but there are a number of them here that are doing very damaging work. So as the frustration mounts about drug use and homelessness and kind of conflating those two things with each other, we are seeing in Seattle, and I know it's also happening in Portland and probably other places as well, this recriminalization of drug use. In the state of Washington, there was a court case that briefly decriminalized drugs, which were drug use and drug possession was a felony. The state came in and made it a gross misdemeanor. And that is the law of the land. But just this month in September, as we're recording this, the city council and the city of Seattle adopted a law on top of that criminalizes drug use, or public drug use, I should say, not private drug use, and simple possession at a local level. And so what that does is it empowers our city attorney, who happens to be a Republican, a declared Republican, to prosecute these cases. And This is kind of again the tension between compassion and punitive approaches, because the legislation that they adopted includes lots and lots and lots and lots of words. I mean, there are something like 35 non-binding whereas clauses that say things like, whereas we have no intent of starting a new drug war, and whereas we won't repeat the mistakes of the past. It includes no new funding for all the diversion programs and treatment programs that it kind of vaguely alludes to. And so because of the situation that we have in Seattle right now, people are, if they are arrested under this law, it's very unlikely they will be jailed. We just don't have the capacity in the jail with our staffing or anything like that. So it's a fairly toothless law in that people are not going to most likely end up in jail because of it, or not in great numbers. But it's also toothless in the sense that it doesn't do anything for people who this is going to target. And it targets specifically people experiencing homelessness, because that is primarily who is out there using drugs in public. They don't have anywhere else to do so. And so what it will do is allow police to hassle, harass, maybe arrest, maybe book people for simply using drugs, and then divert them to nothing, divert them back to the streets. And so this is a great example of how I think we as a progressive city in Seattle talk a big game about wanting to divert people and wanting people to go to treatment. But I think that there is some question about whether people understand fully, including politicians, what diversion means, and certainly what treatment means, and the efficacy of treatment itself. And in any case, we're just not funding it. And so even if there were funding for people to go to 28-day treatment, which is typically what people are talking about when they say treatment, and even if treatment was, a magical car wash you could send people through and they would come out clean and sober, we are not doing that. And it is really a shame, because we do have effective diversion programs in the city of Seattle that are pre-arrest diversion programs, like what used to be called Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion, the LEAD program. It's now called Let Everyone Advance with Dignity, but it may soon become, again, a law enforcement program, because if people get diverted into that program, it's just going to mean that they can't help other people who didn't come in through law enforcement. So there's a certain amount of money that we're spending, and it may divert to being, spent through a law enforcement nexus and not through a community nexus. But there is no additional funding right now, no meaningful funding for actually ramping up programs that work. And so that is an unfortunate reality. And, we're passing laws that seem to have teeth and also seem to have compassion. But in reality, we are once again sort of expecting things to be different without spending any additional money making things different. And that is very frustrating to me as somebody who went through the treatment system myself, has a lot of experience in various modalities of treatment, just as a patient and as a writer who has written about these things. It makes me tear my hair out a little bit to hear the same ideas proposed over and over again that are ineffective. But it also should be frustrating to people living in city and people living in cities that are taking these approaches of recriminalization and these punitive approaches that pretend to be compassionate, because ultimately what we all want is for people to get the care they need, for people to get the housing they need. And we need to have realistic conversations about what will actually accomplish that, instead of endlessly getting mired down in these debates about ballot measures and drug criminalization laws that ultimately don't have any impact on what we see on our streets. So thank you very much for having me. Again, it's Erica Barnett. I am with Publicola, which is a website focused on Seattle news and politics, with focus on homelessness and addiction, and it's publicola.com. Thank you so much.